Our first speaker this evening is Drew Black from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. APAS is a proud member of CFA, and I'm proud to serve as First Vice President of CFA as well. Drew is the Director of the Environment and Science Policy at CFA, where he's worked on environmental policy analysis for the past 7 years. Drew works to ensure that producer perspectives are heard and considered in the development of federal environmental legislation, regulation, and policy. He is currently involved in seeking greater recognition for the voluntary actions that producers are taking to limit their impact to environment and improve sustainability. This evening, Drew will be starting us off with an overview of jurisdictional approaches to offset protocols and carbon pricing in Canada and abroad, along with the potential impacts to agricultural producers. Please join me in welcoming Drew Black.
Thanks very much, Norm. And I'd just like to thank you and, of course, APAS and the event organizers for having me out here. I think it's a great opportunity to get here to really provide a bit of an overview, lay of the land, if you will. I was asked to provide some examples of what's happening across Canada, all the different systems that are programs that are now in development in various stages of implementation, and other actions across the world as well. We'll also provide a bit of an overview towards the end, some of the stuff that CFA has been active in advocating on behalf of agriculture producers here in Canada, internationally, and then our ongoing policy development process in this area as well. I really can't see that. So just in terms of my overview for this, we're going to be looking generally first at what's happening at the global landscape. What is this Paris Agreement? How have we come to where we are? Focusing down into the Canadian context, so what policies are now in place and being discussed here? What are those potential impacts to producers, both known and unknown? And then, as I mentioned, looking at some of what CFA has discussed. So first, looking at the global landscape. The Paris Agreement really has been heralded as a much greater achievement for the global climate change negotiations. But really, why is that? I think part of it was that they approached the premise of trying to lower world emissions differently. So they asked each country to say, what are you prepared to come to the table with and your reductions that you're pledging to make, and how are you going to achieve that? Rather than us all trying to agree to a global emissions reduction. So they went about it in a different way. As such, all the governments were quite pleased with how they negotiated it and its adoption. It was ratified far faster than in any other international agreement and far exceeded expectations at how quickly it was going to come into force. And to focus in on what did Canada say it was going to do under the previous federal government, that is to reduce emissions 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. With the change in power, basically the Liberal government decided they needed an actual plan in order to achieve that. They were going to take this seriously, and how are they going to meet that agreement? A couple notable pieces within the Paris Agreement was it does recognize the need to safeguard food security within climate change negotiations. So this was a real coup for the farmers' constituency, which was advocating for recognition of agricultural production and food security within the context of climate change policy, so that we wouldn't have any disincentives to food production and agricultural growth, recognizing that we need to produce more food for a growing world population, a more affluent global population, and that many of our new products are going to be agriculturally based as well. So as the countries came together and decided what are we going to contribute in order to meet that target that we ourselves have put forth to the world, 90% of those plans to achieve their reductions included addressing mitigation in agriculture. Of course, the U.S. has signaled that they're going to withdraw. That was a platform from the Trump administration, and perhaps unsurprising. But instead of throwing the Paris Agreement into disarray, it almost seems to have galvanized a lot of the other parties, and principally the business community, subnational governments, and China, interestingly enough, which is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, now really sees this as an area where perhaps they can be seen to be leading on the global stage. One of the initiatives that I wanted to highlight here was launched by France during the Paris Agreement. It seems to have flown quite a bit under the radar here in Canada, but it's received a fair bit more uptake within Europe and Africa and other regions. And it's called the 4x1000 initiative. And the premise essentially is if we are able to increase soil carbon content by 4% annually, that in all agricultural soils around the world, that basically offsets the amount of new greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the world. So it's a little pie in the sky in that regards. But the types of policies and approaches that they've recommended in order to achieve this focuses on a lot of the same types of technology and management practices that we're doing here in Canada and Saskatchewan certainly, and really situates quite well with what an image of agriculture in Canada is. So it's looking to achieve the efficiencies, it's zero-till technology, it's bringing adaptation into play as well, recognizing the importance of soil health. Recognizing the importance of the soil health as well, this helps to bridge the gap with not just reducing emissions, sequestering carbon through atmospheric deposition as well, but recognizing that we're able to be more productive with healthier soils as well. In some areas of the world, it's still very much an important piece. It's trying to be communicated out to change practices to best practices, quite frankly. And it's one area that is always ongoing and evolving, but I think Canada's got a pretty good news story to say here. So I wanted to highlight this as one initiative. The other one is the World Business Council and Sustainable Development supports something called Climate Smart Agriculture. That's basically the sustainable intensification of agriculture, looking to achieve mitigation, so reductions of emissions, boosting adaptation and resiliency, and incorporating the concepts of food security within that approach as well. So I guess it's quite hard to see on here, but there's a lot of big multinational business names on here. So starting to look in at how carbon is being addressed and carbon prices worldwide. 42 countries so far have implemented some type of carbon price. That includes carbon taxes, cap and trade system, kind of a hybrid model as well. There's quite a number of other subnational jurisdictions included that. Overall, this adds up to close to 15% of coverage for all of the globe's greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing increasing support from countries and economists that carbon pricing is the cheapest way to reduce economy-wide emissions. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute, but you can see here's just a selection. Obviously, it's not 42 or 80 different prices, but I try to cover the range of where it goes. So of course, we've got Sweden at the very top end with $126 price per carbon equivalent. Going down the scale, being the US dollars, BC's listed as 23. Slovenia, not necessarily always thought of as a highly developed country, has got a carbon price of 18. Beijing has a pilot project, and that's $8 US. Shenzhen, which is another very large Chinese city as well, has a similar pilot project at $5 a ton. The plan, as these things always seem to evolve, though, is for China to develop a nationwide price on carbon by the end of this year or perhaps early into the next year as well. So that's something we're kind of looking closely at and seeing how that may impact trade and agriculture production, and then some lower end ones as well. Looking at where has been movement at the offset level internationally, or looking at protection of forests as the world's lungs. Of course, you've probably heard that phrase before. Forestry has very much been further ahead within this through the RED and the RED Plus programs, which have been around for quite a while now. They focused on protecting old growth forests as carbon sinks and to try and offset any deforestation that would occur, with us raising greenhouse gas emissions quite high for a point in time. Within international negotiations, frankly, agriculture, we're stuck in a little side negotiation, still bickering between, do we talk about adaptation only? Can we talk about mitigation and adaptation? So are we just trying to insulate ourselves and become more resilient against the impacts of climate change, or should we actually be talking about the solution we can play in reducing emissions and in sequestering carbon? It's been stuck there for a couple of years. My hopes aren't too high about it moving out anytime soon. But an interesting thing is a lot of the agricultural offset protocols, really, it's a made in Canada approach. A lot of the work was done as part of the commitment to try and implement the Kyoto Protocol, which Canada hence backed out of. That work transferred to Alberta, where offsets have been in place for quite a number of years. And I'll provide a bit of an overview of that once we focus in on Canada in a minute as well. And I'll also highlight here that California, Ontario, and Quebec, and others within the Western Climate Initiatives have a process right now looking at offset protocol development. That includes a number of ones relevant to agriculture and then others in additional sectors. So looking into the kind of Canadian approaches here, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change, this was the government's basic approach and how are we going to deliver on that commitment that was made for the Paris Agreement. It was supported by 4 different working groups of federal, provincial, and territorial members that were looking at generally 4 different areas, components of it. One was very explicitly a price on carbon. Saskatchewan and Manitoba did not sign the end agreement, as you probably are well aware, but carbon pricing has been a key component of the framework, and that's how the federal government and a number of the other provinces have seen how we can deliver on that emissions reduction. So the carbon pricing backstop technical paper, some of you might have heard this. I know Dwayne and others in APAS have certainly been quite involved in this. That was just recently gone through consultation. We provided some comments on that, as I know APAS did. And that's looking at how the federal government would impose or top up a price on carbon for any province that didn't meet their minimum price. I think there's also a possibility that perhaps some of the smaller jurisdictions might choose to adopt it or just adopt elements of it, choose to participate in a program that's already been developed rather than going through the administrative hurdles and expense to create their own. So I'm thinking a little more Atlantic Canada here, but certainly things remain very much in development. We're expecting, from CFA, new supporting legislation for this piece at some point in the fall. So why is there the focus on carbon pricing? It does have a bit of a positive in that it's a market signal to reduce emissions. It's not the command economy regulating specific industries, setting specific targets for industries to meet, or regulating prescriptive technological approaches to be used or not used. It is putting a price on the greenhouse gas emissions to incentivize consumers and everyone throughout the supply chain to make lower carbon intensive purchasing decisions. So currently 80% of Canadians live within a carbon pricing jurisdiction. It's BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. By the end of this year, we're expecting that number to be higher, of course, but things remain in flux and negotiation on that. So part of the reason why I think we've landed where we are at as well is there are a number of provinces which had a carbon price in place for some time. And the federal government didn't want to impose a new type of system. We had different types of systems, a carbon tax in Alberta, a carbon tax in British Columbia, cap and trade well under development in Ontario and Quebec, and the hybrid system, which encompasses elements of both taking place in Alberta. So there was no easy win to try and merge these together into one in an agreeable fashion. So they decided to recognize that each province could do its own general approach as long as they met that mandatory minimum amount. So that kind of explains the clear priorities from the start, that the provinces would be able to choose how they would price the carbon and how the money collected from that could be allocated. And there's a number of different ways that can be used. One is through offset protocols, through a trading system. You can have reductions in personal and corporate taxes. You can also fund other innovation, research, and development, which would have a good likelihood to reduce emissions. I mean, quite frankly, you could even go into general revenue and not have anything to do with climate change as a possibility. I mean, it's one way that government chooses to allocate that revenue. An important piece here as well is biological emissions are not covered. So it's a big important piece within agriculture, and I've got a graph on that in a second. Current prices here, like as of today in 2017, Alberta's got a price of carbon of $20. That's going to be going up to $30 at the start of next year. BC is $30. On Ontario and Quebec, it says approximately $18 here because that is market dependent on what price those offsets are traded at. Or sorry, what price the credits are traded at within their market. You're probably aware as well the schedule that the federal government has set is a minimum price of $10 per ton in 2018. Is that January 1st, 2018 or December 31st, 2018? I think they left some wiggle room in there on purpose. rising by $10 per year up to $50 per ton by 2022, and at that point that'll be revised, or I guess looked at further to see how it's working. Other provinces and territories generally get different systems in development. Most have action plans on climate change, but still they remain in, I think, a bit of political horse trading, and is still trying to determine what type of approach would work best for their province. Generally, all provinces have accepted that they will implement some price on carbon, with the exception, of course, of Saskatchewan, and some interesting recent developments in Manitoba where they've said that they're looking for a legal opinion on this. Because I understand that looking at a slightly different price. So looking at what actual agricultural offsets are in place now, in Alberta, there's a number of different ones here. Conservation cropping, nitrous oxide emissions reduction, that's really looking at fertilizer management. Within the dairy sector, beef related to age of harvest and the type of feed management. Microgeneration of electricity, biomass, biogas, and a general electrical efficiency. These have been in place, some of these started to be in place within, back in 2002. Overall, $170 million has been paid out up till now. That does include producers, but also the aggregators, the middlemen, if you will, that help to be a bit of the go-between. So a number have estimated that with greater adoption of these protocols, the annual payout could actually be close to $100 million per year, just under that. And I'll get into some of the challenges and why it's not that in a second, largely due to the administrative hurdles and the time commitment, and the payout has just been generally too low to incentivize producers to participate in the program. You're doing the right practices, you got the right technology, it's still happening. The program's too difficult and too onerous. Ontario and Quebec have a number under development around fairly similar fertilizer management, livestock, organic waste management and digestion, grasslands, conservation cropping, forest, as well as afforestation. Quebec has one in place currently, biogas, and there's a couple of working groups which the agriculture industry is involved in helping to develop the parameters on how these are going to work. So some of the challenges is, and this is the big issue, I know it's been a big sticking point, is ensuring that the early adopters are recognized for what's been done already. It's not generally seem to be very equitable to incentivize the late adopters to make that change, and they receive some incentivization. It doesn't recognize the fact that carbon continues to be sequestered in soils as part of business as usual. Often offsets need to demonstrate the additionality piece, so that's looking at it's not a business as usual practice and doesn't provide the fair source of recognition and compensation for producers that continue to do a good job in reducing their emissions and offsetting those emissions of others. There's the portion that the aggregators receive. So again, these kind of middlemen, it's generally important because they help to build up the blocks, and they certainly do play a role, but often producers in Alberta have received about generally half the price of the full carbon piece. So if the cost is $20 per ton, they might get a payout closer to 10. Of course, within this, there's also competition with other industries for funding. So there's a number of other offsets in additional sectors which want to have these, and they often have quite large land bases, a lot of resources. They're able to make the types of investments to participate in these programs. And then again, as I questioned, is it worth your time as a farmer to spend a couple hours doing paperwork for a check for a couple $100? There's pros and cons, and increasingly I think a lot of service and precision-based agriculture companies are beginning to try and integrate some of these protocols within their service stream. So trying to make it a little bit easier and look for leveraging the services that are being offered. Some, I think, would see this as a good opportunity to make it easier for you guys, the farmer, and others are a little worried about who actually owns the credit for what I've done in the end. So this is an emerging area, and I think it's quite interesting. But there are opportunities. So on one operation, you can have different types of offset protocols that you're doing. It could be zero tillage and nitrogen emissions reduction happening on the same field. You're able to put those together, and once you get a couple of different protocols working at the same time, then it starts to become a little more economy of the scale and maybe a little more of an incentive for the producer to participate. And there's also some recent work now about trying to make these a little more cohesive. So again, as I said, we've got a very provincial by provincial based approach right now, and there is some work about how do we make these offsets tradable across borders so that as an emitter in one province, you can buy an offset from someone in another province. And it's very nascent at this stage, but I think that's something that we see as absolutely critical to address the lack of cohesion so far in kind of Canada's carbon pricing policies. So to focus in on kind of how this fits within agriculture and where our emissions coming from, I'm sure some of the speakers later today and tomorrow will delve into this in even greater further detail. But within Canada, agriculture provides about 8% overall of the greenhouse gas emissions in a given year. You can see here on the right, I've broken this down. The top in green is the on-farm fuel use. Below in gray is the crop production. That's largely nitrous oxide emissions from fields. Below that in blue is the livestock production, and again, a lot of that's related to methane emissions from ruminants. And then below zero in kind of this goldy yellow color is the land use change. So that encompasses emissions where you would be perhaps tilling a forage lands or permanent land cover to bring under crop production, but also covers all the capturing of the atmospheric CO2 that's deposited into soil. So there's actually quite a bit negative impact here. It shows that agricultural soils are sequestering a fair bit of carbon. And not all of this, of course, would be covered under a carbon price because the bulk of this really is biological emissions. Globally, Canada looks really quite favorably because globally, agriculture sector is estimated to be about 4% or higher, depending on how you calculate it in terms of global emissions. The one thing I do want to highlight is that within Canada, agriculture is 70% of nitrous oxide emissions, which are over 20 times more potent than CO2, and close to 300 times more potent for nitrous oxide, and 27% of methane emissions, which is just over 20 times potent. But we've got some really good demonstrated gains in reducing the carbon intensity of Canadian agricultural products and production over time. So this is a scale that looks from 1990 on one side to 2013. At the top in the red is the emissions intensity, and that's basically per 1 unit of production, how much greenhouse gas emissions have been associated with that. So if we're able to produce more greenhouse without having the same increase in greenhouse gas emissions, you get an improvement. So that has been quite an improvement, actually, as you can see that line drop. The blue is the overall net emissions, so how much the sector is producing. But between, looking at 2005 and 2014, Canadian emissions dropped by 4%, which is the equivalent of about 2 megatons of CO2. Going into a little more detail by sector, this is looking at grains and oilseeds. The blue in this line is overall output. Of course, it's a bit of a bad year there. And then emissions related to crop production, again, on a steady decline. A lot of this due to soil sequestration. Excuse me, but I just wanted to highlight here that overall, in 2012, output was 25% higher than 1991. Greenhouse gas emissions were only 85% of what they were in 1991. So there's an improvement in emissions intensity of over 30%. So we've got good data showing Canadian producers, you guys, are producing more, emitting less, and the per unit what's being produced is emitting far less than what it used to. Doesn't also applies to the livestock sector as well. So we've got a number of different sectors here: broilers and layers, turkey, pork, and beef. Again, this is looking at the change of emissions per unit of production, that intensity piece from 1991 to 2006. Beef, biggest gains, over 25%, but even on the lower amount, it's still quite significant. Just want to go back for a second. A lot of this, really comes down to the fact that we're addressing the cost of inputs. We're building efficiencies. It's responding to market pressures. Canadian producers are really quite efficient producers. It's shown by this slide, which is based on the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Working Group on where to find gains in reducing emissions by different sectors. There's little to be gained in the agriculture sector because a lot of that work has already been done. So obviously there's areas to reduce emissions, but they're fairly marginal in their estimation. I don't think this tells completely the whole story. It was produced under very short timelines. I think there's additional analysis and information that can go into this. But each one of these sectors, ranging from reduction of methane from cattle through dietary changes and reduction of age at harvest, conversion of marginal land from crop to permanent cover, increased planting of nitrogen-fixing crops, getting those that aren't on no-till onto no-till, manure management technologies, and precision fertilizer application. They're all up to and below a single megaton equivalent. If you look at the same graph for different sectors, they're all fairly large gains. And they've I guess usefully as well, introduced the estimated cost per ton in order to achieve these. Some are fairly reasonable perhaps, others remain really quite expensive to get there. So just to highlight some of the work that we've done here, on the international side, we're a member of the World Farmers Organization as well, and active members of the Working Group on Climate Change there. Through that, we regularly contribute to policy positions that are provided at global climate change negotiations and other global events. We recently updated the quite old policy for the World Farmers Organization, which helps guide them in the statements that they make. We're also a member of the North American North American Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, which is a nascent but very much producer-led approach to addressing climate change. And as an organization, we're accredited to the climate change negotiations and do participate fairly regularly. That's me actually with farmers from Ontario, India, France, and a representative from an environmental NGO in the US speaking at a side event last year in Marrakesh. On the more national stage, we've provided a number of submissions through the Pan-Canadian Framework. The recent technical paper I mentioned on the backstop regulations involved a number of other sustainability initiatives that look to benchmark and track the data that shows Canadian producers are doing a good job when it comes to carbon management in terms of overall emissions as well as intensity. That includes the National Environmental Farm Plan Initiative, as well as the Canadian Roundtables on Sustainable Beef and Sustainable Crops. And we're currently underway with leading a CFA internal committee looking to update our own policy around climate change, provide a good opportunity for sharing of information across the provinces and commodities on impacts of carbon policies, and developing a bit of a GR strategy that goes along with that. So some of our positions that we've had for a while and others that are kind of recently emerging in light to the ongoing difference in policies across Canada is we need to be speaking about carbon intensity rather than absolute emissions. So as being one area that's really quite favorably positioned to produce more food for a growing world population. In fact, something that we've been charged with through such reports like the Barton Report. The budget has had a bit of an aspirational goal for Canadian agriculture to increase production and exports by. A number of provinces have these as well. But in order to do so, we may actually need to have overall emissions rise, especially from managing the nitrogen and carbon cycles, in order to supply a growing world population. Now, if we're able to do that through the lowest carbon intensity piece, that positions us well against other competitors that people and supply chains increasingly begin to look at this. Certainly not all are interested in the carbon impact of which agricultural agricultural products that they're purchasing, but I think that some are beginning to start looking at that now. Another of our policy pieces is like that climate change must not create a perverse disincentive for food production, so we need to recognize and safeguard food production. All on-farm fuel use must be exempt from carbon pricing. This is something that we've seen, again, a patchwork across Canada. Some provinces have exempted on-farm diesel and gas. Others have said no way. But there's more than just diesel and gas used on farm. We need to make sure that natural gas, propane, and other fuels would be captured by this as well, as we'll be having higher costs of production, but also need to compete both internationally against our competitors that do not have that increased cost of production, as well as domestically against imported products which have not had that increased cost of production. For some sectors, this is going to hit them a lot harder than others. Notably, the greenhouse sector is really quite worried about this. And others may be able to weather it a little bit more. So the offset protocols, they can work, but they need to be designed to encourage producer participation, and that's where that's what we haven't really seen. So there needs to be a fair payout to producers. It needs to be a system that's easy to navigate and easy to implement on farm, not quite so much administrative hurdles and time consuming in order to participate in the program. And environment ministries really need to develop a better understanding of agriculture. I think that is really quite cross-cutting. We don't see a business as usual in agriculture as the same for other industries. Even if you're looking at tillage practices on a farm, if you get a really particular wet spring, you may be considering using a bit of tillage just to help dry out the soil so you can get a productive plant season later on. We're constantly having to respond to changing weather and patterns, impacts from climate change as well. And we need to make sure that we're able to do so in a way with our best knowledge reduces greenhouse gas emissions and incentivizes any kind of carbon sequestration. So it's not the same as other industries. Agriculture is part of the solution. I think increasingly, a little more medium term, we're going to see more interest in the bioeconomy, so using agricultural products in order to replace those derived from higher carbon intensive oil and gas. And so we need to be able to, in a position where we're able to supply that. Increase investments to support producers to adapt to climate change and build resilience within the farm operation also need to be considered. This is a piece that we've brought forth as well. So, what are the opportunities from the current approaches to pricing carbon? Financial opportunities for producers are going to be mixed, I think. The offset protocols where they have been established have brought those administrative costs, which have been a bit of a disincentive to participate, even for those that qualify. But it is a made in Canada approach. It's one that I think has a lot of room to expand. We just need to have the right policy environment and make it a little easier to navigate. Scale impacts the ability to participate in offsets as well. So on large farms, really those looking in Western Canada, it's much more likely that when you crunch the numbers, it'd be worth your time to participate than a much smaller farm in Eastern Canada. So we need to look at how that's going to work and make sure that producers across Canada would be able to participate in these. Cost-shared incentives would require upfront costs from producers. That's one area where we need to look a little bit further into as well. Looking at the rebate system, for example, where BC and Alberta now have said that they'll rebate 80% of the carbon tax for natural gas used in greenhouse, it still requires a bit of cash management. And if this same type of approach is adopted across other provinces and for different sectors of agriculture, that's something that needs to be kept in mind. It's a good opportunity, I think, to really push for the tax exemption for on-farm fuel use and make sure that applies to all on-farm fuels. Some provinces that's been more possible than others, but it's been very clear that it's been from a province-by-province basis. That's where the decisions are getting made. Agriculture products are to continue to replace fossil fuel-derived products. Increased investments in energy efficiency will continue to drive down costs for some inputs. And again, the bioeconomy. But there's a number of challenges here as well, too. Current approach really fails to acknowledge the producer's unique situation as managers of carbon and nitrogen cycles within your operation. And there's a need to respond to the market and weather conditions, which I spoke about. There's a position as being the price taker in the market as well, and I'm sure most of you understand what I mean by that. And that you're not in a position where you can pass on increased costs of production to your customer. Global and domestic competitiveness, as I mentioned, will have to compete against products which are produced without the additional cost of production of a carbon price. And if that means that additional investment and additional production moves outside of Canada, that can be something that we call carbon leakage. So there'll actually be greater greenhouse gas emissions on a global level, and Canada's will shrink. So we might look at here, but we're not really doing much to solve the problem. So this is something where we're really pushing the intensity piece as if carbon emissions are less intensive in Canada in agriculture, shouldn't we be looking at investment there rather than areas where they're much higher? The patchwork of implementation strategies from one province to another disadvantages producers more in some provinces than others. And we're a little bit worried about internal competitiveness issues in Canada developing as a result of that, especially as we recently signed and implemented the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which is supposed to try and get rid of the type of competition barriers within Canada. Different opportunities for producers. So some, as I mentioned, will also have the opportunities, not just the additional costs. And we're looking at different offset protocol systems across Canada. So a lot of work really needs to go into making sure that these can work together across provincial boundaries so that as a producer, you're able to get the best price for the offset credit that you've been able to make. And we're pushing for the incentive versus a regulatory approach. So this is one area where through Growing Forward 2 and cost share type approaches, I think there's room to expand to looking at how we can enable the agriculture sector to adapt to climate change and potentially higher prices due to carbon price. But there's still a lot of unknowns because many of that is just coming forward now and still in negotiation. And then there's the question of how the revenues generated be allocated, as that's determined differently by one province to another. In some cases, a fair bit of that could come back to the farmer. In other cases, a fair bit of that could be going to projects which could reduce greenhouse gas emissions but aren't based in the rural economy, and you really won't see that much of it. So just a couple of conclusions here. How do by the way? Oh, perfect, 3 minutes. And this is the point where you can see I've run out of stock photos as well, so the slides have gotten a lot more dense. But it's the provinces and territories that really have that discretion about how they get to go about implementing this if they do. And that's where the action is in terms of trying to lobby and get provincial and territorial governments to recognize agriculture's uniqueness, the types of support and incentives that it needs in order to continue to thrive under a carbon price. That can include exemptions and rebates to compensate for the higher costs. Offset protocols is what I see as a small but potentially new revenue stream. A number of provinces and AFC are looking for the next Growing Forward 2, which we should get some details about by the end of next week, actually, about how that's going to be better integrated within trying to achieve Canada's climate change commitments. And again, exemptions and compensation for agriculture agreed. Sorry, I've said this already. Trying to determine the potential costs and opportunities for producers depends a lot on how the programs are developed, and there's a lot of unknowns. So how much will the transportation sector, for example, pass on to the farmer? How much is this going to affect your fertilizer prices? Will it have an impact on crop protection products as well? Overall, if we see this inflationary aspect of a lot of costs, again, the farmer is not really in a position to be able to pass that on to most of your customers. So we need to have the right types of policy mix in order to address this and make sure that we don't competitively disadvantage yourselves. So thank you very much. I've got a couple more slides here I won't go through, but I understand the presentation is being posted on the website after. So this is just a little more detail on current CFA standing policy around both carbon tax and cap and trade. This is the stuff that's being updated right now, but there's some good information in there as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Drew. Now we have some time for questions from the audience. So for those that have questions, proceed to the mic. And when you're recognized, please state your name. And if you're with an organization, state your organization. And to accommodate as many questioners as possible, please just ask one question and then take your seat. And just before I get to the first questioner, there is a lot of gray hair in the room, but I see other colors too. And if you're tweeting out, the hashtag is APAS Carbon 17. So with that, go ahead.
Jeremy Welter, APAS. Drew, thanks for coming out and giving us a presentation. Lots of really good information in there. I had a question regarding the slide where you showed the reduction of emissions from poultry production, turkey production, and beef production. My question is specifically with regards to beef production and the massive gains that we've gotten in the reduction of greenhouse gases. How much of that has come from the use of implants, making our animals more efficient in their conversion of feed to muscle, as well as the use of antibiotics to reduce methane production in their rumens? And how much of that are we going to lose as our producers start looking towards export markets like Europe, where they're not allowed to sell that type of beef production?
Is this other mic on?
Hello? Yeah, it's on now? Okay, thanks. No, that's a great question. So the slide I showed does go back a couple years. It's based on AFC data, which I was able to actually graciously use with their permission. So it ends looking at 2006. So there's certainly been quite a bit of changes within the industry since then. I wouldn't be surprised if we looked at that number currently, if we had the right data, looked back to 1991, it'd be even lower. So I actually don't have a good breakdown in order to answer your question in detail. I think the bulk of it has often come from efficiencies gained in feed, from a lower age going to market as well, better management practices, and in some cases more consolidation of the industry, feeding more grains to cattle as well.
Thank you. Go ahead. Okay,
There we
you're
go.
on.
I'm Aaron Cron, Lakeshore Tree Farms. I'm here representing the Canadian Nursery Landscape Association. My question is, there was one slide that had the CFA positions, and we're wondering if those positions apply to non-food producing agriculture, such as my association, which is turf production, floriculture, flowers, cut flowers, and landscape ornamentals, trees, shrubs, perennials.
Thanks. No, it's a great question, and just so you're aware, the Canadian Ornamental Horticulture Alliance is a member of CFA as well. But it's something that we approach all our policy development for all farmers of all commodities and right across Canada. So we're really very much trying to be inclusive of all commodities. Our policies are developed by our member in conjunction with our members and agreed to at our board table. So they've all got an opportunity to provide input through that, through our committees that develop the policies. And we see each one of the policies, well, of course, some would be more relevant to particular regions, perhaps, or commodities, or even subsectors. We do see them as applying right across the board. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Marion?
Marion McBride with APAS. I was curious about your statistic about nitrous oxide and the fact that that is several hundred times more impactful. I'm wondering if you have thought about, or if there's been any discussion about trying to incentivize soil health as opposed to using nitrous oxide, that might be as impactful or more impactful if we could end up with that result, as opposed to focusing so much on the carbon, since the numbers are very high in favor of that change. So it would be incentivizing that.
Great, thanks. It's a good question, and it really relates back to nitrogen fertilizer use on farm, and there's a number of good BMPs, beneficial management practices, or best management practices, depending which corner of the country you're from, that do look at trying to have the incentives and the cost-shared programs to put in place technologies and management practices that will result in less nitrous oxide emissions. There is the nitrogen emissions reduction protocol in Alberta. It's fairly new, and this is one of the more onerous protocols for producers to participate in to some degree, but that is one approach, again, trying to incentivize producers to emit less through better, more accurate fertilizer management. Very, very, I would say, well in line with 4Rs. That's also a policy that CFA, or a program that CFA is supportive of. And trying to focus more really on the soil health, that's absolutely, I agree with you, but overall trying to talk to environmental policy peoples, and, perhaps even myself on that, it's a much harder piece to convey, because it's very holistic. And really they're interested in, well, what change is going to reduce emissions, and how do we focus in on that? But absolutely, we focused on trying to boost the incentives, not the regulatory approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Marianne Posberg from the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. So I'm appreciative of the fact that no jurisdictions in Canada want to take biological emissions into consideration, but are there any international jurisdictions that would like to do so?
That's a good question. I haven't heard of anything credible. Let's hope it stays that way.
Good news.
Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rick Swenson. I'm a former APAS rep and a 47-year farmer and dabbled in politics. You had a chart up there, and you had great information about the price of carbon all over the world. And it would seem to me from looking at that those prices have more to do with what the political environment in that country will handle for a price and how strong the environmental lobby is. I mean, the difference between Sweden and China was fairly significant. In Sweden, you do whatever you want. In China, you might be an organ donor if you're a big environmentalist. So I guess my question, I'm also a former Minister of Energy and Mines, so I understand commodities. And why before this started wouldn't we put in place something in Canada where we would have a price discovery mechanism that was Canada-wide rather than province by province? If carbon is worth X based on, say, a ton of diesel fuel as your benchmark, wouldn't it be easier then for us, all of us, to use incentives to be better than to simply use a price to more or less punish us or even us out or something? I just, because we all know what commodities are. I can go and every commodity I grow I can price. And that determines how good I am at what I do. And I just think that would make more sense before we got into this, that we would have some type of price discovery mechanism that we would all then say, this is where I fit in the carbon world, and we'll get better at what we do to mitigate that. Is that something that's far-fetched, or is that just something that we can't do in the Canadian reality?
Another good question. I think, a while ago they were looking at trying to have more of a national cohesive approach, and some of you may remember some of the political discussions around that going back. And then there was, they moved on from that, quite frankly, for about a 10-year period in Ottawa, and we didn't have those discussions anymore, which led the provinces to, a few specific key provinces really felt the need to move forward in this area. And somewhat unfortunately, they decided to go with different types of approaches to pricing carbon and how they would address climate change, which led to the point where we're at today, where different provincial systems don't really work necessarily well together. It's not cohesive. There's not an ability to scale it up to one national program. So, I mean, that's part of it. But looking at the price discovery mechanism, looking at how carbon is priced with the CO2 equivalent, I think the green lobby and a lot of economists really latched onto the idea that the carbon price is the way to do it. It incentivizes consumer behavior, so we will choose greener or less greenhouse gas emitting choices right across a full suite of products and services, commodities, and that will be the main driver. I think there's some choices as to what's most politically palatable for different parties in power that have also led us to the position that we're at now. And, a national plan to some degree perhaps could have been a little bit easier to ensure that we wouldn't have these disparities within Canada. But going the regional route also provides the opportunity for producers where agriculture looks quite a bit different in Saskatchewan than it does, say, in New Brunswick, to ensure that they're recognized most appropriately as can be.
Go ahead.
I'm Haley Carlson. I'm the policy coordinator at the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. And I'm interested in your opinion on whether you consider agriculture, particularly in Saskatchewan, because agriculture is one of our largest emitting sectors, as being a net producer or a net sequesterer of carbon, and how that will change about to mid-century, given that many scientists have said we need to be around net zero emissions by mid-century in order to remain under 2 degrees globally.
So I'm a little hesitant to extrapolate from some of the graphs I showed with the increased production with lower emissions, because it's really a big unknown in how to do so. In terms of whether agriculture is a net sink, it depends on whether you include fuel use or not. There's different ways in how you can calculate the carbon intensity of all this, as you're probably quite well aware. But there's some really great information that's recently starting to come out of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, where they've looked at the about 10 largest field crops by a regionalized approach, so within provinces, and really calculated it out with the best available knowledge and everything, including the published literature and the great literature that's out there around sustainability that have looked at this piece to develop the carbon life cycle analysis. So for some commodities grown in some parts of Saskatchewan and some areas, yes, they do appear to be actually carbon negative. So they're sequestering more than anything that's included within the farm gate. That does include fuel use. Others, not necessarily so at this time. But as that information hopefully continues to be collected and updated on a regular level, will be really interesting to see how that moves forward. I think there's a lot of opportunity for improved innovation, especially within the livestock sector with precision agriculture. That could really potentially be a bit of a game changer. There's lots of very interesting startups and new technologies that we're often hearing about. It's not necessarily my sector of expertise to delve into that one too much, but I suspect we'll probably have some good discussion about that tomorrow as well. So you never know when we'll have a big game changer.
Great, thank you, Drew.